Hello, welcome to the third part of the player movement series. Today we are going to implement sprinting and crouching for our character. So first let's go to edit and then to project settings, and here in input manager let's set two buttons for crouching and sprinting. So I'm just going to change fire 1 to crouch because its positive button is left control, and let's change fire 3 to sprint because its positive button is left shift. So we have our key bindings for crouch and sprint, and now let's close it and then open the player movement script. In here let's first go for sprinting, and then I'll teach you how to do crouching. So let's define parameters. So header sprint and params. And in here we need two parameters. The first one would be a serialized field, private bool is sprinting, which is false, and then a serialized field, private bool private float sprint speed, which I would say 15 is good. So this one is to see if the player is sprinting, and this one is the speed that the character will sprint on. So in update method, let's see if the player presses shift. So let's say if input dot get button down, if they press shift, so let's say sprint, sprint. If they press shift, then is sprinting is true. And then if they take their hand off the shift, we would say if input dot get button up sprint. If they do that, is sprinting would be false. And then in the move function, we have to say if is sprinting is true. If it's true, then our player's speed should be different. So we would say, I'll just copy this here and change this speed to sprint speed. So if you're sprinting, just run with this speed, and else if you're not doing that, then go with the normal speed. And if we save and go back to Unity, if you play the game, you can see that I'm walking right now, and if I press shift, I'll be fast and I'll be sprinting. So let's go back to the code for implementing the crouching. So in here, we first have to define a few parameters for our crouching. So let's say header crouch params. The first thing that we need to do is to get the player's actual height. So we would say private float actual height, and we would get it in the start method. So let's get it right now. So in the start method, let's just bring it here. So in start method, let's say actual height equals to player controller dot height. So when the game starts, the player control dot height is the actual height. And the next thing we need to get is to see if our player is crouching. So let's say serialized field private bool is crouching, which is false. So we should see if the character is crouching or not. The next thing is to see what is the speed of the player when they are crouching. So let's say private float crouching speed. I would say 2 is good. And the next thing is that we need to see what is the crouch time for our player. So we would say private float crouch time, so the time it takes for our player to crouch or uncrouch. I think 0.1 is good. And the next thing would be to see if the character, how much the character will crouch. So serialized field, private float, crouch percent. So so in here we have to define a range. I think 1.2 and 0.8 is good. So basically here, point in F, and F. So basically here, when we crouch in game, we would have some percent of our height. So basically, like when we crouch, we have now 80% of our height. So this variable is for that, to see how much we will crouch. And for the default value, I think 0.7 is good. And the next thing that we need to define would be to see if the character is in the animation crouching. So is during crouching animation, which is false. So now we have to define 3 functions for crouching and standing up and the animation of crouching. So in here, let's define 3 functions. The first one would be a private void crouching. The second one would be a private void stand up. And the third one would be a private enumerator crouching standing up animation. In here we should see if our character is actually crouching. So let's say if is crouching. So if it's true, the player cannot sprint. So let's say is sprinting would be false. And the player controller dot height equals to the actual height times crouch percent. So like the actual height, if it's like 2 and the percentage is like 0.8, our height would be 1.6. And then for standing up, we would say if the character is not crouching, so if the crowd is crouching is false, we should say start coroutine and then the name of this function, which I just copy and paste here, and it just executes this animation here. So let's code the animation. We should first say that when this code executes, we are in the animation state, so is during crouching animation would be true here. Now let's define 3 parameters in this function. The first one would be a float time passed, which at first is 0, and the second one would be a float final height, and it would be the actual height of our character, and a float of the current height, which now is the actual height times the crouch percent. So the animation happens in this while, so we should say while time passed is less than a crouch time. We should say that the player controller.height equals mathf.lerp. So here we should give it 3 parameters. The first one would be the current height of our player. The second one would be the target, which would be the final height. And the third one would be the time that we would say it's time passed divided by the crouch time. And this current height will linearly become the final height with this function. And then we should say time passed plus equal time, the delta time, and then yield return null. And then when all is done, we should say is during crouching animation would be false. Also in here, let's add player controller.height equals to actual height, because sometimes they might differ a little bit, so we just make sure that they are it is equal to actual height when it's done. Now let's go back to the update function and let's just handle the inputs in here. So for crouching, we should say if input dot get button down, and let's say crouch here. If we press the button here, we first will have to switch the is crouching boolean. So here's a problem. If you are under an object and you want to uncrouch and stand up, you might get your head stuck on the object. So for standing up, we should check if our player has a distance between their head and the object. So when you want to stand up, you have enough space to stand up. So for that, let's say if the first is crouching is true, if we are crouching and physics dot raycast, so for to see if we have enough distance for our player to stand up, we should cast a raycast, and by that we can see if we have enough distance. So the first parameter would be the position that you want to cast a raycast from. So it's a player camera dot transform dot position. So this one is the position. Then it's the direction. So vector 3 dot up. So next one is the direction. So vector 3 dot up. And the last one would be the distance that we want to cast the raycast. I think 1.5 is good, but you can change it depending on your game. And the last one we should see if the player is not during the crouching animation. If during crouching animation is false, then we can do this. So is crouching would be false. And then let's say else if the character is not crouching and is during crouching animation is false, and we're not during the crouching, is crouching would be true. And then let's call two functions of crouching and stand up. And here if we press, and also this bracket here, and in here if we press control, it will set this crouching to false or true depending on if you want to crouch or we want to stand up, and then it will call these two functions and we are able to crouch or stand up. And the last thing we need to change is here that we have to change the move script for our character. So first we see if the character is sprinting, and if they are not, we check if a character is crouching. So if his crouching is true, then the player controller that move, we change the speed to crouching speed. Here our character can crouch and actually and move with the crouching speed. So let's save and go back to Unity. So in here we can see that we have a cube that we cannot pass through, and if we crouch we can pass under it, and if we press the control again we cannot stand up. But when we come here and we press control we can stand up, and when we press control our movement speed will be less. So if you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel, and I see you in the next videos.